Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Guru Parulkar.
Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to the 4th Open Networking Summit. I am Guru Parulkar. I serve as the chair of Open Networking Summit. Please meet Sadef Oskana. She is the one in charge of all the logistics and operations, and she is the one who puts this show together. Okay? As you know, we had to move our event date from mid-April to early March. That meant Sadef and her team had to work extra hard to put everything together and pull this event together. I should also mention one more thing, and that is we could not avoid the conflict with IETF, and that meant we are missing maybe 100 or 200 people, and we are really sorry about that. And some of you probably had to miss IETF to be part of ONS. Hopefully we will do better next time. I also recognize that all of you are making significant commitment of your time to be at Open Networking Summit. And we really appreciate that, but here is our promise to you, and that is you will have the 3 most stimulating days at ONS. And as a result of that, it will change how you look at networking, how do you make decisions about networking going forward. Let me give you the big picture why I believe that is the case, why I'm so enthusiastic or I'm so optimistic about it. As you know, that the current network infrastructures have systemic problems. We are not able to introduce revenue generating services quickly enough. On the other hand, the CapEx and OpEx of these network infrastructures are growing very quickly as the traffic is growing. And what that means is that the network infrastructure industry, that is all our industry, is under a lot of pressure. So the good news is that SDN as a disruptive innovation shows potential that we have an opportunity to transform this network infrastructure. And by network infrastructure, I mean data center, service provider, and enterprise. Now, when you look at all of these together, this is potentially $100 billion plus business, industry, whatever way you want to think about it. Now, I'm not 100% sure it is 100 billion because I don't pay attention to those kinds of things, but I know for sure it is huge. Okay? So that is the first observation. The second observation is when you look at any disruptive innovation such as SDN, it goes through the following adoption cycle. It is called the S-curve. Now, we are at the beginning of this S-curve. The good news is because of what is going on in the network infrastructure industry, plus whatever innovation we have come up with SDN, we have put SDN on this S-curve. So if you look at last 6, 7, 8 years of work, the only thing we have done in some sense is put this disruptive innovation on this S-curve. But over the next several years, we have to make SDN as a mainstream. Today there are early adopters such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, NTT Communications, and few others that are actively deploying SDN in their infrastructure. But it will be still several years before it is going to become mainstream. And that is the opportunity. That is what is exciting about SDN in this particular space, that we have an opportunity to take it from where it is today to making it mainstream. So, our hope and our promise is that at ONS, you will get to be informed and prepare to participate in this transformation, and some of you will get to lead this transformation as well. Now, let me give you a preview of ONS, our approach towards organizing ONS. So we always anchor our events around the leaders that come from the larger ecosystem that includes inventors, innovators, business leaders, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and so on. Now, around these leaders, we try to create the highest quality content that we can. And that content includes presentations, tutorials, exhibits, and so on and so forth. And we don't let anything come in the way of creating this highest quality content. For example, at ONS, nobody pays to speak at ONS. So this is not based on sponsorship. Not a single talk or a single piece of content is decided by the sponsorship. It is based on the criteria that how this presentation is going to help the audience, and that is you. Okay, so that is an important thing. Finally, what we try to do is to try to create some quality experience for you, to create an environment that facilitates quality dialogue in a fun and exciting setting. And our hope is all of this together will help you participate in this transformation and lead this transformation. And as more and more people participate and more people help lead this transformation, the SDN community grows, and that helps make SDN more successful. And that is, at the end of the day, that is our mission, to help SDN be more and more successful. Okay, now let me give you some specifics. So we have 4 keynote speakers. So we have Vinod Khosla. He is from Khosla Ventures. He is the biggest champion of disruptive innovations, and he has participated and involved in many of these disruptive innovations over the years. And he is going to come and talk about SDN as a disruptive innovation tomorrow morning. Then we have John Donovan. He is the Senior Executive VP at AT&T, where he is leading a major transformation of AT&T. And by transformation, I mean infrastructure, organization, and processes. Okay? And he's going to come and talk about how SDN is going to impact AT&T's infrastructure as this transformation happens, and how SDN is going to enable innovation in its infrastructure. Then we will have Amin and Albert Greenberg. Both of them are leading SDN and SDN adoption inside Google and Microsoft. And they are going to come and talk about their experiences of deploying SDN in these large infrastructures. And I hear Amin, as usual, is going to have something significantly new to say on Wednesday. So come and check it out. Don't miss that. Okay? Then we have a number of plenaries from leading early adopters like NTT Communication. Again, I was previewed to some of the presentations, and so check it out. There is going to be a very interesting presentation from Ito-san as part of the plenary. And then, of course, we will have presentation from a research organization as well. We will have several hot startups that come and talk about how they are developing SDN solutions. We'll have some challengers that are trying to challenge the status quo to come and talk about their approaches. And then we'll have leading incumbents also come and talk about how they are approaching SDN. And the bottom line is, all these presentations will essentially focus on how they are trying to help network operators transform their infrastructure. Now, as you know, some will be doing a better job than others. Some will go into more details, and others will keep it at a higher level to protect their proprietary information. And so we have to read between the lines, we have to connect the dots, but the whole idea is how these companies are leading this transformation. Okay? Now, as SDN is growing, we have to add more sessions, we have to add more tracks. So for example, we have technology track where we had some presentations on SDN building blocks. We will also have a session on application-driven SDN. We also have hot startups and VC track, where a number of startups are going to come and talk about their disruptive product, disruptive technologies. And then there will be a session on by venture capitalists. They will talk about how they are approaching the whole SDN space for startups and investments. As always, we have a research track where leading researchers are going to come and share their latest research. But more importantly, what we are trying to do is to promote a lot of interaction between academia and the industry. Unfortunately, in the field of networking, there has not been an event where academia and industry come together, and that's what ONS is trying to promote. We also have developer track, where what we are trying to do is to bring developers of the open source projects together so they can work together. As networking is moving from box and hardware oriented industry to more and more software oriented business, what we want to do is to help developers come together and help them take a prominent role in events like ONS. Finally, I want to mention that we are going to have a special session on SDN and NFV synergy. As you know, these are very complementary trends or technologies, and so we want to bring that synergy together at ONS. In fact, there are other presentations that are also going to talk about how companies are realizing NFV with the SDN control plane, and that's something very interesting and something which is very important going forward. Okay. Now, we also have number of exhibitors. There are more than 60 exhibitors that are going to demonstrate SDN-based technologies and solutions. Again, this is something ONS does kind of religiously, that these exhibitors are not going to come and demonstrate some arbitrary product or technologies. These are about SDN, these are about open flow that they are going to come and demonstrate. There are more than 10 demonstrations from academic institutions and research organizations as well. This time, we are doing two new things. One is what we are calling showcase demos, where what we are trying to do is to demonstrate end-to-end SDN that use open source building blocks and open source building blocks and open flow enabled switches from multiple vendors. And the idea is to have three of them. One is the show floor network this year is based on open flow and SDN. So that is like a proxy for enterprise network. We have Internet Tools nationwide network, which is open flow and open source SDN based, which is like a proxy for service provider network. And then we have demonstrations on open cloud and NFV as well. Another experiment we did this time is to have live demos in sessions to select the SDN Idol of the Year. Unfortunately, I was in another track, so I could not be there, but I hear it went well. And tomorrow we will announce the winner for the SDN Idol competition. Okay, so in summary, what I'm trying to say is that ONS over the next 3 days will help inform and prepare you to participate in and lead this particular transformation. And that is why I'm so enthusiastic and excited that this is worthwhile and you are at the right place. Okay, now I want to take a minute to tell you about ONS as an organization. Okay, so ONS, first of all, is a non-profit organization that you should remember. So we are not in the business to build an event business like many other event companies that are about building event business. We are here to help SDN succeed, and we are here to serve the SDN community, and that is you. Okay. Another thing, as I mentioned earlier, is at ONS, no one pays to speak at ONS, and we don't pay anyone to come and speak at ONS. Okay. And that is what, yeah, Jim is complaining that I didn't pay him. Okay. So, but that is what helps us maintain very high quality, because we are not influenced by sponsorship and all of that to put our program together. Okay. Now, on one hand, it's very exciting that everyone has embraced SDN in last couple of years. So that is the exciting part. But you also know that today everyone is calling everything SDN. So that means it has no meaning that everyone has embraced SDN. Okay. So that means I'm obliged again to tell you what we think is SDN and why we think network operators are interested in SDN and how we think SDN is going to manifest. So give me 5 minutes. I will, for some of you, this is a repeat because I keep telling it every time. So please forgive me if you have heard this before, but let me do that. So what is SDN? So the most important thing about SDN is the separation of data and control plane, where the idea is to take the proprietary, embedded control complexity out of these boxes, lift it out, put it in software running on servers. That is the first thing. The second important part of SDN is make the protocol between or interface between the control plane and the forwarding plane a vendor agnostic open interface. When you do those two things, there are a couple of things, right? One is the boxes, that the switch and router boxes become very simple and they become simple forwarding devices. Second thing is they get a simpler uniform forwarding abstraction using which the control plane can program these devices. Okay, so that is one aspect of it. Now the control plane is built using multiple layers of software or multiple subsystems in software. The lowest level, and that is kind of the critical one, is what we call network operating system, or sometimes that is called controller. Now the job of the controller is to build what we call network map as an abstraction on the top. So network map not only has the topology but all the state information related to network that it presents to the application. And then you have an interface to this network map. So the big idea here is that if you can present that network map to application, then writing applications become very, very simple. They have to basically manipulate this local network map, and then the network operating system takes care of everything else. Okay? And that is what enables new applications, or people can innovate faster and bring new control and management application to the marketplace. And that is what the potential of SDN is. So then why SDN? And why network operators want to use SDN? Here are the few reasons. The first one is it brings openness and programmability to the infrastructure. So you can innovate faster and you can customize it yourself. It accelerates new revenue generating services with the right abstractions, open APIs, and competition. It helps you reduce OpEx because if you have this control plane lifted out and you have this right API, then you can do a lot of automation. You can build autonomic systems so that you don't need as many people to manage the network, and that helps you reduce OpEx. And finally, it also helps you reduce CapEx because rather than building your infrastructure using these complex proprietary boxes, you build them using simpler forwarding devices. Okay? So this is, at ONS, every time you hear a presentation or every time you are having an interaction, you should ask, how is this helping me realize these benefits for the network operators? That is at the core of SDN. That is at the core of ONS. These benefits are the ones that should be the topic of conversation when we are talking about any of these solutions. How would SDN manifest itself? So in reality, we believe what would happen is rather than using these closed proprietary boxes to build the infrastructure, what would happen is we will build this infrastructure using what is being called white boxes, that is built using merchant silicon, open source network operating system, and then rapidly emerging set of control and management applications or services. This may not happen overnight, but believe me, this is inevitable. This is where the world is going to go sooner or later. Now, how would the end customers or the network operators consume SDN? So one way to think about it, you can divide the network operators or network owners into two categories. There are one category of operators that will take these building blocks that I mentioned before and build their own infrastructure, and they will build their own services. And if you look at what Google, Amazon, NTT, Microsoft, they're doing exactly that today. They are building these, they're taking these kinds of building blocks to build their infrastructure. Okay? Now, it is true that every network operators cannot do this. Okay? So what would happen is there will be some solution providers, you can call them integrators, who are going to take these building blocks that are out in the community and build complete solution and offer them to providers that don't want to do it themselves. But still, it will allow a lot of flexibility and programmability so that you can customize and you can build a solution for a particular network operator. Okay? But the good news is these early adopters such as Google, Microsoft, and so on, they are already doing it, and they're willing to come and share their experiences with us. If you look at all the 3 ONS or 4 ONS, all these people have come and talked about how they're building their infrastructure, what are the benefits they're realizing. And so that is so good that we can learn from these experiences and then help the other network operators or network owners as well. Okay, so this is kind of my last slide. At ONS, you will get to see the transformation taking shape, and some of you are already doing it and leading this transformation, and that's terrific. Okay, so now, oops, I think there is a, okay. So now I'm come to the main attraction, okay, of this afternoon. Okay, so I'm done with my kind of introduction to ONS, introduction to SDN. So now we are going to talk about the panel, which, oops, okay. So this got reversed a little bit, but so the panel is on how open compute, networking, open source will shape future of computing and networking. Okay, and so we have a list of very distinguished people: Najam, Dan, Jono, and Jim, and I'll introduce them in just a minute. Okay, but I want to go back to this and say, you know that there's something open is in the air. This is the new trend, right? And I don't know what. So, there's the ONF, there's the open compute, open source, open stack, open daylight, open networking lab, open networking research center, you name it, and there is this openness everywhere, okay? And something, you wonder how to make sense out of it, right? I wonder about it as well. I am part of many open organizations. I wonder sometimes what is going on. So these are the gentlemen who are going to help us make sense out of it. Now let me take a minute to introduce each one of them. So Najam Ahmed, so he is responsible for Facebook's global infrastructure. So he has a pretty big responsibility, and I'm amazed that his team is maybe 50 people or 60 people, and that's pretty amazing that with that small a team, he is able to build and operate this big infrastructure. Before that, he was in Microsoft Global Online Network, he was at MCI UUNet, so you can trust that this guy knows something about network infrastructure, okay? And not only that, he is also on the Open Networking Foundation board, and he's also heavily involved in OCP. So that means he should know something about this open trend as well, okay? So that is Najam. Then Dan Pitt, my dear friend and my co-conspirator, okay? So he is the new, or whatever for last 3 years, SDN and ONF champion, okay? He's the executive director of Open Networking Foundation, and he has worked for all these companies that you can name, okay, in his career. IBM, HP, Bay, Nortel, and then he decided he had enough of networking. So he quit networking and went and became a dean at Santa Clara University. Then we had to invent SDN to bring him back into networking, okay? Then Jim Zemlin, so Jim is our open source champion, okay? He is the executive director of Linux Foundation. He has been there for many years, and Linux, when it comes to open source, Linux Foundation is kind of at the peak of it or the champion of it, and so he is the executive director leading that. He has been in mobile, cloud networking, and he has been an entrepreneur as well in his past life. And so when it comes to open source, I'm counting on Jim to enlighten all of us, okay? Finally, last but not the least, Jono Bacon, okay? So as you know, open source is all about building community. And so Jono's specialty is community building. He is the community manager for Ubuntu, one of the largest open source communities. He runs something called Community Leadership Summit. He has written a book on community and so on. And he also has been entrepreneur, author, and speaker as well. So these are our distinguished speakers. In next 1 hour or so, they are going to enlighten us about everything open. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Najam.
Thank you, Guru. Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Open Compute project. This is something that we started about 2.5 years ago. I'm waiting for the slides to come up. There we go. So, oh wow. Sorry, the slide builds are gone off already. Let me back up here. Anyways, so the open compute, the idea was there's a lot of work in open compute software that's been done over the years, and that's a proven model to innovate. But it only applies to software in most cases. So what we started doing was to think about how we take open software or open source concepts and apply it to hardware. And so about 2.5 years ago, we started this thing called Open Compute. If you see the blue bullets on the left side, there was one official member of Open Compute, which was Facebook. We had 3 sets of technologies that we contributed to that. They were all from Facebook. So essentially things that we developed in-house for our data center and mechanical design, electrical design, things of that nature. And we pushed that out as open source. We made the specs available so you could actually take the blueprints of the data center that we built in Prineville, Oregon, and you actually can go to a builder and have them build that replica of that data center if you wanted to. So making that source available for people to use. The idea was that what we have achieved, which was like 38% more energy efficient, 24% lower cost, we can take that design and put it out there for people to take it and improve from there and have the community, which has a lot more expertise in a lot of different areas, be able to use those designs and actually make them better. Today, there are over 150 official members of OCP. Dozens of contributions in all sorts of space, from data center, rack designs, servers, storage, motherboards, all sorts of different interesting motherboards, one called Group Hug, if you guys are into social. Then there are a bunch of partners that are playing in this open compute space. So my customary logo slide, if any of you, I ever gave you a hard time about a logo slide, you can return the favor to me today. It was the first time I'm putting a logo slide up, but there were too many to mention, so there you go. Tons of companies that are involved in part of OCP, developing different technologies. A few new members that we just joined in the last summit. Microsoft being one of them that joined, was present at the last summit. We've been going international as well, taking the OCP to Japan, and then we took it to Taiwan as well. So what's the impact? If you think about open source, it's been really impactful in a bunch of areas, and a lot of other part of the stack that we use today in our infrastructures were essentially proprietary or locked or closed. And the idea of OCP was to take different parts of the infrastructure and figure out how we get technologies that are more open source on it. And in the beginning, OCP was primarily focused on data, rack, server, and storage, and network was still very much closed. So in May last year, started a project to essentially start tackling some of the network concerns, which was sort of the beginning of our open switch conversation. So we announced a project for open compute called Open Network. Really didn't have a whole lot of idea where this was going to go, because this was a slightly different approach than what we had done in the past with OCP. In the past, OCP would build technology and then made it open source. This time around, we were saying, okay, we want to figure out what open looks like for network hardware. And then we put a group of people together to start working on it. So our first session was at MIT, where we had at least about 180 some people in the room that came over and wanted to talk about network, and we literally had this whiteboard. We took a bunch of notes and started to figure out what exactly does it mean to actually build a network. So out of that, we came up with a charter, and the concept was really, really simple. How do we take networking and disaggregate? The idea was that if you want to make something open source, you first have to disaggregate it. You can't have a vertically integrated system that is open. What that means is proprietary silicon, proprietary hardware, proprietary operating system, and then proprietary protocols on top. You have to disaggregate them to be able to actually take advantage and build open source. So in the discussion, the initial discussions that we started around this network project, that was the key thing that we went after. Can we make the network switch and take that network switch and disaggregate into components so that when each component then can be open and you can have multiple choices in it. So we looked at the network stack, started at the bottom, which is the easiest place to start, a top-of-rack switch. Essentially, I'm assuming everybody knows what a top-of-rack switch is. A switch that sits on top of a rack aggregates all the servers together. The easiest part of the network topology to essentially tackle. But the idea was not to worry too much about the hardware itself, but the disaggregated model was what we were after. Can we build a switch that doesn't have an operating system that comes with it, and the only thing you can get is the CLI out of it? So after a few months of work, Broadcom was the first spec that we put out. It's still under review, but there's a spec that Broadcom built. It's based on their Trident 2 chipsets. Available in multiple factors. The spec for this switch is public. So if you go to Open Compute site, you should be able to pull down a spec for this switch and be able to actually figure out what this switch looks like and what these different components are. The more interesting part was the switch library, or what's the SDK under it. So one of the things that's always been challenging with network hardware is that you have a box with a silicon which is proprietary, which is the Trident 2 chipset in this case, and how do you talk to that chipset? And that today is proprietary for most vendors. Broadcom's working as part of the OCP solution on working on an open API. They're calling it OpenNSL, that will essentially allow you to then talk to their chipset through this open API. And that's a huge gain for operators or people who are writing code against these switches to be able to talk to the processor directly without having to actually go through a proprietary interface. Mellanox was the other switch manufacturer that, or chip and switch, they both do both, that is proposed a design that is, again, under review. We're looking at the details of the spec. Again, the spec is available on the Open Compute site, and they have actually made their SDK open. So you can take the Mellanox chipset, and how you talk to the chipset is actually open sourced as well. So they're going down the same path. The other interesting piece of code that was developed, and this was developed primarily by Cumulus, Cumulus Networks, is called ONI, Open Network Install Environment. You can think of it of a bootloader of sorts. And it really tries to emulate the sort of compute model where you have a processor or a server that boots, it does its self-test, and then essentially looks for an operating system. And you can point it to a flash, a USB, or URL discovery, point it to an operating system. And the operating system then can boot and run whatever software you want to run on it. So the simple idea being, you buy a switch, today you can run your traditional protocol sets, and then you can just reboot and come up as an OpenFlow switch. And that's the disaggregation that we were looking for, that we can take a piece of hardware and without having to rip and replace the entire appliance, we can then actually run different sets of code on it, and each user can actually then figure out what is best for their environment. Going back to Guru's model that he showed, where you have a hardware instead of operating system and then applications on top, you can pick your hardware, you can pick your operating system, and then you can pick your applications that you run on top of it. And the whole idea being that your investment in software can then go from hardware to hardware, and then you can actually port across platforms. So ONI is actually available on GitHub, so you can go download it today and play with it. Lots of different vendors are actually supporting it. So there are ODMs that actually you can go buy a switch that has ONI on it, and then you can run operating systems on it. So you're disassociating the operating system from the hardware itself. Another proposed contribution to this OCP network project is from Big Switch. Rob Sherwood is working on building a Linux platform. So make a Linux platform available for people to try. So you can go get a switch from any ODM and then run a Linux operating system on it. And then after that, you can choose which protocol sets you want to run on top of them. Intel's working on one as well. They're a little bit further behind, but they're actually working on proposing a switch as well. So what are we going to do next? The two switches, primarily Broadcom and Mellanox based, are going through reviews and going through approval process. There are lots of proposals for lots of contribution for different technologies, for switches in the leaf, core, spine of whatever your terminology is of the network space. So building switches of different size and capabilities. And then really focus on software and what runs on top of it. So a Linux OS level, that's work in progress, and then tools and applications on top. Monitoring is really interesting for us, building a lot of interesting applications on top of that operating system at that point. So the way OCP works is very simple. You put a bunch of people together, collaborate, people contribute different sets of technologies, and then consume it. So OCP is very much like ONS in that model, is that there's no pay-to-play model. Nobody gets to pay to participate in OCP. You essentially bring your technology, you contribute, you decide to use it, and you move on. And that's about it. We'll hand it off to Dan.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Dan Pitt with the Open Networking Foundation. Happy to be here at the 4th Open Networking Summit. Love working with Guru and Sedef on this. We think it's an important vehicle for gathering the community that's supporting open networking in the larger context of open information technology. So today I have just a few things to talk about, what open networking is in our definition and how SDN helps foster that. And then how the open networking part relates to the rest of the open world as represented by people on this panel and others. And then I have a little announcement from ONF in this context that I would like to share with you today. So the reason this is all happening is because the people that use and operate networks are telling us in very clear terms a number of messages. They want to manage their networks in a consistent way that's aligned with their business. And that includes the different parts of their network. And they want the infrastructure to be flexible and agile, as Guru said. They want to create revenue-producing services quickly under their own control, their own writing, their own procurement, and not have to depend on network equipment vendors to give them features to introduce those new services. And that means they need open interfaces and an abstracted view of the network that the applications can rely on. And then finally, they don't want to have lock-in contracts with vendors anymore by virtue of the nature of those products and their proprietary characteristics. So they want the open interfaces to the equipment, and they want the hardware to be optimized for price performance, but controlled by remote software. So in SDN, we have a number of open interfaces, and they have different purposes and, in fact, different characters. The important part about an open interface is that if you put it in the right place, it will foster rapid innovation above it and below it. We've had this experience in the internet world. We had the narrow waist of the IP protocol in TCP with lots of innovation above that in apps and below in network technology. We're doing this now the same way, essentially, that the computer industry did it in the 1980s for networking to solve the problems I described on the previous slide. From the top down, we have an API, a set of APIs between the applications and the network. And the network is abstracted so they can use the features of the network without caring how it's built. These, we think, should be mostly de facto standard agreements created by industry based on their experience with rapid software innovation. Between the control plane and the data plane that Guru described, we have a protocol because it's physically separated, and often the data plane is implemented in hardware, whether in merchant silicon or network processors or other technologies, as well as in software. And that separation from the control plane, between the control and the data plane, requires a protocol that we think should be open and standard, and that's the exact purpose of OpenFlow. So a de jure standard is done by a committee. We don't think the northbound interfaces should be defined by a committee, frankly. And then there's a new phenomenon. Can we have an open interface of some sort to the switching equipment itself so that your client can be in the switch independent of the chips? Now, Najim just mentioned that we have a publication, in fact, by Mellanox of the API to their SDK. That's really the first time we've had something like that. There was a promise. This was at the Open Compute Summit last month in San Jose. Also, at that same meeting of the Network Switch group, Broadcom said they're looking to do the same thing, and Intel said they're considering it very seriously. Now, these APIs to their SDKs still describe their proprietary SDK and the hardware abstraction layer. Will it become perhaps an industry-agreed API to the switching silicon? I've heard rumblings about that. I think it'd be a very interesting development for the market. The important part about open that we advocate is that not only is it published, not only is it available to all, but that it's not controlled by a single party. It's hard to innovate on something that somebody can change at will and leave you outmoded. So where does OpenSDN fit in sort of the larger context of the open movement? Well, I'm showing a number of things here and where we think they fit in and who is sort of leading these charges. Starting at the bottom, we have open source hardware for switching now for the first time, thanks to the Open Compute project. We have this open southbound protocol that ONF is leading the charge on. That's OpenFlow. We have an open source controller activity going on in a couple of places. Open Daylight, which is under the auspices of the Linux Foundation, which Jim Zemlin will talk about. And we have ONOS, the Open Network Operating System, under the Open Networking Lab, part of Guru's Open Networking Research Center. The open northbound APIs, I've said, we'll leave that to industry, and that's a factory icon, to work out what works through great experimentation. And finally, open source cloud computing and some applications through things like OpenStack, OpenCloud, CloudStack, and I'm showing the Yetzi NFV as sort of an open way of coming to an agreement on how you run some of these applications. So there's a large context, and all the pieces have to be there for the whole movement to be totally successful. These are organizations with whom we collaborate very closely. And of course, the gorilla, I should say the penguin in the room, underlying all of this, is Linux. And you'll see it in the switches, certainly in the servers that run the network control plane, and of course, in the applications. And it leads to an interesting sort of projection of the future of networking. Is the future network really nothing more than Ethernet, x86, and OpenFlow? So my announcement today is that we are announcing the availability of an open source application for OpenFlow written on Open Daylight from the Open Networking Foundation that does some basic network tapping. Network tapping is a very popular application. I'll list on the next slide the companies that already do it in a commercial way. It allows you to use OpenFlow to tap off certain flows, letting them continue to be routed through the normal layer 2 or 3 methods that you want, or through OpenFlow, but you don't have to use OpenFlow for the path selection. And you send it to some controller and you analyze it. It could be for security. It could be for some kind of traffic engineering application. It's non-disruptive and non-invasive to the network. It's a great way to get used to working with OpenFlow. So we developed this just for fun. We contracted for its development. It's really just an educational tool. We'll put it out there. We're not running a project. It'll be on our GitHub repository. And we got a lot of fun learning about what it means to write something, how independent or not can it be of the switch, and what's it like to run something on Open Daylight. This only works on OpenFlow 1.0 at the present time. You're welcome to update it and fork it. And as I said, it's a low-impact experience. Tapping was a convenient application. It's not the main point, but ONF finds that more and more you can really validate your ideas only with code. So we're doing more with code. I'll describe more about that in my talk on Wednesday. So you can see it at the expo today. The code itself, some blogs about the experience, and a webinar are coming in the next few weeks. We're not quite done with it. Press release goes out at about this hour, and you can read more about it. If you're really interested in the tapping part of this, I must emphasize, ours is not a commercial grade product. These members of the Open Networking Foundation already have commercial grade tapping applications. If this is important for your business, run, don't walk to one of these folks. My conclusion, open networking in the context of openness is really a small number of fundamental principles. We separate the data and control planes, and we separate the network from the application, all of these using different types of abstractions and different processes for standardizing them. The important thing about this flavor of openness is that nothing is controlled by a single party. It means it's community determined, community based, and community improved. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having. This is my lucky day. I mean, people competing about who's more open than the other, and all this talk of Linux and openness. I've been doing this for over 10 years, and that's a sea change from when I first started. In fact, when I first started, I remember telling my wife on our first date what I do for a living. I work at this nonprofit, the Linux Foundation, and just the crestfallen look on her face was palpable. But today, I want to talk about sort of a broader concept of how open source is impacting IT. And although the Linux Foundation does host the Open Daylight project, the Linux Foundation is sort of a foundation of foundations. We host large-scale open source projects in addition to the Linux kernel, which is the world's largest open source project. We host projects in the Internet of Things and software-defined networking and in hypervisor and lots of different things. And you know, what I've learned through the experience of not only working with folks on the Open Daylight project in STN, but in other projects is the importance of being on the right side of history here. The importance of doing things in a way that history proves will work. And there are a couple of big trends that are going on that sort of overlay over software-defined networking that I think are important for all of you to keep in mind. And it is so fun to be at an event like this and see the work that Guru and Dan and all of you folks are doing in such a disruptive way. You know, I feel like, you know, 10 years ago with the Linux Foundation, we were part of, you know, being on the cutting edge of disruption. Now I feel like kind of an old man lecturing people on disrupting when really the real disruption is going on right here. But a couple of the trends that I think really matter to what's going on in SDN are twofold. One, I want to quote Mark Andreessen in that software is really eating the world. You know, what we're seeing here is hardware being abstracted into software, and you know, software becoming really the cornerstone of the tech industry. And I know that at a networking event, there's probably a lot of hardware folks in the audience. You're going to have to forgive me, but your days are behind you. Software is now where it is. And I really think this is true. And the complexity of software is obviously increasing as this happens. And that's where open source comes in. As software eats the world, as the complexity of software really grows and grows and grows, you have to find a better way to make software than trying to hire a few smart people, lock them in a room, you know, feed them pizza and beer, and hope that they output, you know, code. That just doesn't work anymore. Open source has proven that by collaborating, by working together, we can have a better, faster way to create software. The concept is pretty simple, right? That all of us are smarter than any one of us. And that has really been proven, and sort of the existence proof of this is really what has been accomplished in Linux. And I want to show you just how big those accomplishments are and why I suspect that the same kind of accomplishments will happen in the SDN space using open source development methodology. These are just a few numbers that show you how well open source can work in business. You know, one of the things people say is, well, if you give everything away, how is anybody going to make money? And clearly, Linux has proven that you can do both. 1.5 million mobile phones are activated every single day running Linux. Android is based on Linux. There are a variety of other mobile OSs based on Linux. 92% of the world's high-performance computing systems run Linux. 85% of the world's global equity trading platforms run Linux. New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange, Tokyo Stock Exchange. 700,000 televisions are sold every single day running Linux. $1 quadrillion is changed every year just on one Linux system, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. There is a massive multi-billion-dollar economy based on open source software that works in this world every single day. And that is the business case, but what's more interesting is the development pace. 10,923, 5,547. That's the number of lines of code added to and subtracted from Linux, the Linux kernel, every single day. Greg Crow-Hartman, who's the long-term stable maintainer of the Linux kernel, does a research on how fast Linux is changing. It changes, I think according to his latest report, 9 times an hour. Nobody can compete with that pace of development. It's produced a $10 billion value that people can build on. And that's why you're seeing in these presentations, you know, Linux being used to create a network operating system in the Open Compute project, because you can leverage, you know, the 2.7 million lines of code that were added to Linux last year to create all of the value on top of it. And that's really what's going on here. Open source is really creating what will be a new Pareto principle in software development. Does anybody know what the Pareto principle is?
Used to.
I had to look it up on Wikipedia too, okay? I just admit it. It's the 80-20 rule, right? The idea that sort of in sales, you know, 20% of the salespeople are responsible for 80% of the sales. And that's really happening in software as well. In fact, the Gartner Group has a slide in terms of sort of what is the best-in-class use of open source. Companies moving, organizations moving from a non-strategic use to a strategic use of open source. And the best organizations really use about 80% of the code they use to create the products and services that they offer to their customers. 80% of that being open source is the best way to do it. 80% open source, 80% leveraging this multi-billion-dollar R&D investment that's out there for free, and then 20% of the things, focusing on the things in your development that really matter to your customers. Well, and you could release that via proprietary code or open source code, but really focusing the 20% of the code that matters to your company or your customers rather than reinventing everything from scratch. Sony is a good example of this. 80% of the software in their mobile handsets are open source. And Sony's not alone. And Sony's probably an easy one to look at and say, well, Sony, does anybody here have a Sony phone? Fine. But even Apple, how many people here have an iPhone? You know, the Android phones are really wonderful. You should swap them out. They're based on Linux. I strongly recommend them. You should get a little round of applause there. All right. But even Apple is smart enough to understand what I'm talking about here. For all of you who have an iPhone, go ahead and take it out and look in the settings, the general, about, and legal notices. And what you will find in there, just click through, what you will find in there is the GPL license, open source code. You'll find the name of Linux Foundation Fellows. You'll find oodles and oodles of open source code in every iPhone and every iPad that is out there. Because even Apple, this great tech success story, understands that nobody makes anything on their own anymore if they want to win. And that's what's going to happen in the world of software-defined networking. Because this is how software is built from now on. People are going to collaboratively work together on the core components of technology, most of which will be non-differentiating, most of which is essential, but isn't going to be that special thing that really makes your business or your customer succeed. And we're seeing that already with multiple open source efforts in software-defined network. I gotta pinch myself when I think of that. In particular, I think of how much we're on the right side of history, because when I first got involved working on an open source networking project, it was met with a lot of cynicism, frankly. And I couldn't figure out why. And I think the reason is because this industry has spent a lot of time in standards bodies debating what a specification might be, in fact, doing it in a combative way that's focused on process, then finally discovering and sort of publishing a specification, and then letting everyone kind of go at it on their own to try and implement that specification. So it's very focused on process, very focused on combat. Open source is nothing like that. It's very hard to manipulate the process of an open source project because code is the lingua franca of an open source project. Code talks, and focus on process kind of doesn't work. People will go fork your code. They'll go do it somewhere else. And so as SDN becomes more and more well sort of implemented and grows, I think that open source will be the basis for that, and people will add value very high up on the stack in order to differentiate their company or in order to make their company successful. And it's not just an SDN, and it's not just in IT. Collaborative development really is being on the right side of history. An entire genre of collaborative development methodology has been created and published. It is being used in industries outside of the tech sector, mining, life sciences, and so forth. And so my one thought to leave all of you with today is as SDN becomes more and more of a reality, and unlike the year of the Linux desktop, this probably is the year of SDN, stick with the open source development model, because I think it will serve this industry very, very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. How's everyone doing? Really? How's everyone doing? That's more like it. All right. First of all, many thanks to Guru for inviting me to such an esteemed keynote panel. Networking really isn't my world, so many of you won't really know who I am. My name's Jono and I work at Canonical as the Ubuntu community manager. I've been there for about 7 years. Ubuntu is one of the largest open source communities in the world, and I lead a team of 6 people who are driving strategy and execution around this large community. I also run a community management consulting practice where I work with various organizations to build internal and external communities. And I'm really passionate about the profession of community management. It's a very new profession. It's a very young art and science. So I wrote a book called The Art of Community and run the primary community leadership summit every year as well. But today, I want to talk about value. Every one of you in this room will understand what this is, whether you're an exec or an engineer, a marketeer, whether you're in the management side of things or the business development side of things. You put things in and you get things out. And a lot of the value that we put into our work is relatively understood. But one area where it's not particularly understood is how communities fit into this. Every open source company, every open company, every software company should have a community management strategy. Communities are no longer those weird people who smell funny, who live in basements with their families and write code. They're the driving force that's building much of the infrastructure that we use in the world today. So today I wanted to talk about the value of communities and how we build them effectively. Now, Jim Zemlin, a friend of mine from the Linux Foundation, his organization did a really interesting piece of work, and Jim touched on it just a second ago. to value the cost of rebuilding the Linux kernel today. So most of you will have heard of the Linux kernel. It's driving significant pieces of infrastructure in the world, as well as devices that sit in our pockets. And the value of that piece of software was $1.3 billion. Now, in reality, Linux itself is not particularly useful by itself. It needs to sit inside of an operating system, inside of what is more commonly known as a Linux distribution. And the estimation there was that for that Linux distribution, it's about $10.8 billion. And I think the example there was Fedora. So one thing that's very, very clear here is there's a tremendous amount of monetary value in that software by building that software. But in reality, stats are interpreted in different ways. They mean different things to different people. Everyone reads them in different ways. And to me, that dollar value is interesting, but it's not really the most interesting thing when we look at Linux. What's interesting is the human investment that went into building that software. If you peel back the covers of how Linux has been built, over 10,000 developers from over 1,000 companies have contributed to that kernel. Now think about that for a second. 10,000, imagine this room with 10,000 people in it. It'd be a bit tight. But 10,000 ideas and perspectives and leadership styles and goals and insecurities driven by 1,000 companies with different perspectives and corporate cultures and ideas and competitors. It's a tremendous amount of people working together towards a common goal. But again, just to remind everybody, this is one component in a platform. In Ubuntu, for example, there's 2,000 different components that ship with a typical Ubuntu system. So when you multiply those numbers, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are working from thousands of different companies just to build one of these open platforms. So what's clear here is that the value that we get from the software is not just the monetary value, it's the value of people working together. And this is where communities fit in. In reality, there's a tremendous amount of complexity that's associated with building communities. And this is, in my mind, is traditionally the domain of the community manager. This is what a community manager should be doing. Now, the problem with this is because this is a relatively young science. When I started at Canonical 7.5 years ago, I'd never heard the term community manager. I was partly attracted to the job because it said the words community manager in it. Now it's a very common term that's used to describe many different people because the industry is grown around it. Some people think that community managers are social media people. I wouldn't agree. These are not community managers. This is a valuable asset, it's a valuable focus to build growth in social media, but it's not community management. Likewise, community management is not a strain of marketing. It's not a type, an approach to marketing. This isn't community management either. But also, some of us in the more engineering-centric side of things tend to think of community management as kind of engineering management as well. There we go. It turns out that this guy is the representative for engineering management on Google. If you type engineering management into Google, it's this guy. My experience of working with engineering managers is not that picture. He actually works at Google as well, which is slightly suspicious. But in reality, community management brings together many of these different disciplines. I've traditionally rather glibly described it as a combination of being a leader, a politician, and a therapist. You need to be a leader both in terms of leading people and building and leading in terms of technology and processes. But you typically are dealing with many different stakeholders from different organizations with different ideas and competitive strains and all the rest of it. That's where the politics comes in. But it's working with people. And by working with people, people often need guidance and help and assistance, not just professionally, but personally as well. So that's where the therapy tends to fit into it. But to me, that kind of glib way of describing it is not really interesting. What's interesting, in my mind, is that a community manager should be there to optimize the community for success. You've got thousands of people all over the world who want to work together to build something, as Jim said, that is bigger than any individual. And to me, a community manager is there to make sure that no barriers get in the way of that person contributing to your particular project. So, traditionally, I mean, we've learned how to build communities in an observational manner. Linus Torvalds, when he first created Linux in 1991, he didn't say, okay, I'm a community manager, let's get started with this. He's a programmer. He's not only a programmer, he's a Finnish programmer, right? So he didn't work, it's not like he was born and raised in Silicon Valley where he's surrounded by software people. He lived in Helsinki. And he learned how to grow a community by watching other communities that had formed around it. And this struck me about 3 or 4 years back that my entire career was built on watching other people do stuff. That was a little bit of a depressing day to realize that I've spent my entire life copying everybody. And this is when I realized that what I need to do I need to start writing down my approaches to community management for those people who haven't had the luxury of being able to cut their teeth on it. And this is the reason why I wrote the book, was to write a book of repeatable best practice that people could use. Now, what was interesting, when I first published this book in 2009, I started getting a lot of emails, and many of them had the same question, and it was this: how can you achieve that level of productivity with volunteers, and I can't do that with my own employees? And what this taught me a couple of interesting things. This is when I started becoming a consultant as well, is that there was a desire to understand the people aspect of communities, which is an art. Working with people is an art. There's no doubt about it in my mind. Not everybody can do it, and it takes a certain subtlety to how you work with individuals. But they wanted to understand that with the combination of repeatable science, of being able to use reusable processes and approaches to build successful communities in a predictable manner. And this is when it really struck me that what we're really seeing here is a renaissance in community. The Renaissance was this magical time in history when the later Middle Ages was connected with the modern world. People started writing things down. This is when art and philosophy and math and all of these different things started flourishing because people started learning things and sharing it with other people. Gone are those observational days of community management. We're starting to see a repeatable practice that's happening. And this is the reason why I organize the Community Leadership Summit every year and wrote the book as well. So community management is actually very simple. And I want to, before I get off the stage, well, walk over there, I want to share a couple of key things about how this works for those of you who are interested in this. Community management is actually relatively straightforward. It's about taking this. This is what I developed this a few years back. I call it my on-ramp. This is how people participate. You need to explain that you can participate. You need to ensure people have got the knowledge to be able to contribute. They need to know what to work on, and then they need to feel great about what they're doing. Every community in the world has some variation of this. This is when I'm building a new community in Ubuntu or other communities, I model it on satisfying each of those 4 different areas. But with this, you may have somebody who shows up for 3 or 4 days, and they contribute like crazy for 3 or 4 days, and then a new PlayStation 4 game comes out, and they're gone. This happens quite a bit. So what we really want is significant and sustained contributions. We want people who are going to stick around for the long haul. And this is relatively complicated, but it can be boiled down to something very simple. If you want people to stick around and follow that on-ramp repeatedly, you have to build a sense of belonging. Now, this sounds relatively simplistic. It sounds a bit fluffy and something you'd hear at a preschool or some kind of hippie commune. But at the end of the day, when you take away all of this stage and the lighting and the computers and the screens and everything else, we're all animals. We're human beings. And human beings have a relatively simple set of needs. And one of them is to feel like they belong somewhere. This is one of the reasons why so many people are attracted to communities. This is one of the reasons why open source is so successful. So put together an on-ramp, build significant and sustained contributions, and build a sense of belonging. But the way we do this has to be rigorous. There's many a community manager out there who has not taken a structured approach, and they've been fired instantly, and they should have been fired instantly. This is the way I think you should do it. You should first of all understand what you want to achieve with your particular community, wherever you may be. Where do you want to be in 1 year? The second thing you need to do is to build a strategic plan. You need to understand where you're going, write it down, set the expectations about what you want to accomplish. But this is the critical thing. Make it rigorous. It's very easy with any kind of social-orientated work, whether it's community management or HR or whatever it might be, to have fluffy goals and fluffy deadlines. You've got to make them rigorous. You've got to look at it in a year and say, did we achieve that, yes or no? There's not going to be any maybes. And then most importantly, execute with honesty. If we go through our plan and we execute it with honesty, we'll be successful. If we follow these approaches, the on-ramp, significant and sustained contributions, build a sense of belonging, and take a rigorous approach, we end up building scale. And when we build scale, it means that we can reach out to 10,000 contributors across 1,000+ companies. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so I guess I hope you agree that this was an excellent set of presentations. A lot of good stuff to learn and build on. So we are running a little bit late, so I'm going to restrict my set of questions to just few and then open it up for you. So you should start thinking about your questions as well. So I have a question for maybe Jim and Jono to some extent, that on one hand, we heard all the wisdom of open source, all the excitement of open source, but sometimes, and now I'm also trying to work in the open source area, and sometimes I wonder whether the only thing I'm doing is moving value from one set of companies to another set of companies. So for example, if you look at networking as an example, if we do open source network operating system, am I extracting value from companies that build networking boxes today and passing it on to someone else? And is that a worthy goal? So how would you kind of respond to this feeling, or this is what happens with open source?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the technology industry in general, regardless of open source, if you're not providing value, money is going to get taken from your company and passed to someone else. And so I think that's just a rule of the tech sector in general. I think in open source that can be accelerated, certainly if one organization is commoditizing the product of a company that's an incumbent in the market, let's say, through working in an open source project or releasing large amounts of source code, yeah, then to some degree you're doing that. But I think that, and so, yeah, I think to some degree that's happening. But I think there's a more important point, which is, and we believe at the Linux Foundation, which is sort of the coal and steel of technology, the things that run our lives, the basic infrastructure shouldn't be owned by the Carnegies alone. That it's important to be a shared asset, and that conveniently, collaboratively developed asset that by the license is shared is a better, faster way to do it. And so, again, that's why I think we're on the right side of history. Does that mean there are going to be some winners and losers in the financial markets, let's say, as companies are unable to keep up with that change? Absolutely. But if an organization is not looking at open source and at the phenomena that are happening as a result, I think they're in trouble. And I talk to companies about this all the time when they say, well, what should we do about open source? And we're not sure that this is quite good for us. And my response is, it's better to be at the table than on the menu. And that is what will happen if you ignore open source.
Jono, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd follow up on that in the sense of, I think one of the subtle aspects about open source that we often forget is that it intrinsically gets people out of their comfort zone. I think when we apply this to anything, whether it's software, whether it's music, whether it's movies or anything, when people get in their comfort zone because they feel a sense of influence or control, you get suboptimal content that comes out of people. If you look at Linux as an example, it's just one of many, many examples. It's created an environment where people can innovate. And it's, when we talk about disruption, it's really a fancy word for getting people out of their comfort zone. And as Jim says, there's going to be winners and losers in that. If you don't stay competitive, then you're going to end up losing. But to me, that's not a flaw in Linux. It's a flaw in people who have either given up the fight or are uninterested in innovating.
Okay. So Najam, so for example, on one hand, I admire what you're doing with Open Compute project, Open Switch, the project you're doing. Do you get a pushback from other companies saying, on one hand, you're trying to commoditize, you're trying to extract value out of these companies, and on the other hand, Facebook is a very for-profit company, pays $19 billion to 100 people, and all of that, and now, from one hand, you're giving so much value to something and extracting value out of something else. Do you get pushback?
I think it's 19 billion to 55 people.
Or maybe that is not appropriate.
I'm just joking, I have no idea. So first, let me touch on the first question you asked. There's not just value being moved around, it's value generation as well, right? Where you get in, the trouble that you get into with closed systems and designs and vertically integrated solutions is that you're getting the brain power of a specific solution or a specific company rather than the 10,000 developers as we talked about. So how do you get the knowledge base and abilities of the broader community to help you design and build something? That's one. Then the other part is the control factor that comes in, where if you try to control what you have and then just incrementally grow, the pace of innovation is really slow. So the idea to get comfortable with is that it's disruption and chaos is okay, everybody contributing is okay. People who find the better value will still make money, right? Or will essentially be able to succeed in the model. So it's been interesting in OCP that we felt the same thing when we started the OCP itself, is where we were like, well, wouldn't the Dells or HPs of the world be really concerned? Now you're making a server design available to the rest of the world. But the HP and Dell are very much partners in OCP. And what they're doing, saying, great, if you guys have certain ideas that make sense for data centers of your size, we will implement that and make it available to the rest of the universe as well. So there are contributions that people can make. Then there are other value systems being built where there are companies that are system integrator type environments where they're taking these open source type solutions and making a package or a solution, if you will, for other companies that may not have the capabilities to do that. So it's really about distributing what work needs to get done in different ways and creating different value propositions for people.
Okay, one last question from me, and then I'll open it up for you guys to have an opportunity as well. So, we talked about all the successes with open source. I'm sure you know there are many projects, open source projects, that don't go anywhere. They fail. So what makes an open source project succeed versus an open source project to fail? So Jim, again, you are in open source. I want to give you a chance first.
See, that's a complex question. And by the way, open source projects don't die. They're just like soldiers. They just slowly fade away. People ignore them. I think there's a core set of ingredients that really matter in open source. One, there should be a transparent development process. I think that's important. People want to see the code being made. They want to be able to participate on it. They want to wrap up into that community, and that should be made public and transparent. It should be based on merit. So it should be a fair, transparent system. There should be a well-balanced governance model. And these are fairly well established across a wide variety of open source projects. You have, Linus Torvalds, who's sort of the benevolent dictator of Linux. I'm his boss, by the way. He's just like my daughter, actually. They're both adorable. They both are genius, and neither of them listen to me. So there's also, OpenStack has a great model of elected technical committee that's made up of maintainers. So these are fairly well understood models. It should be under an open source license. I think there are a common set of licenses that people want to see so that they can invest in the project. And then all of the community building aspects that Jono mentioned. And when you have those core ingredients, I think it really works. When it gets interesting for me, though, is when they're very mature. And you see developers starting to identify themselves with the project more than their company in many cases. I know in the Linux kernel that is definitely what happens, is people see themselves as sort of Linux developers, and then they happen to work for IBM or HP or somewhere else. Even in Open Daylight, an SDN project, one of the maintainers started as an employee at one company, at Cisco, and now is an employee at another company, Red Hat, same maintainer, same role in the project, right? So it transcends that.
Maybe let me interrupt. So you're describing what is kind of a recipe of a successful open source project. And now I'm assuming people understand it. Still, I'm assuming some open source projects are failing or fading away. So why?
Yeah, also timing is one. So there's a strong argument that Linux would have failed if Sun Microsystems had open sourced Solaris under an open source license earlier. This is the at the table versus on the menu argument. But they didn't. So, there's timing, there's also technical basis for whether it fails. I mean, if it's just crappy code, it's not going to work. I think it's probably one of the biggest sources of failure of any project. It's just the code sucks, and so nobody uses it. But that's not something that's something that's in any marketplace at all. So lots of different varieties. Okay,
maybe I should stop at this and allow audience to have an opportunity to ask questions, because I can go on for a long time. So any more questions from the audience?
Sure. I'd be interested in the panel's perspectives on patents within open networking and SDN.
In what?
With what?
Patents.
Anything specifically?
Patents. Intellectual property.
Yeah,
Patents.
intellectual property.
So anyone wants to take it? I mean, Dan, you want to say something in the context of SDN first, and then we can hear more generically how open source projects deal with intellectual property?
So certainly there is considerable creation of intellectual property going on in open networking and other fields. I think over time its value is changing a little bit, and it proves to be less of a barrier to competition and really more what I think defines success is speed to market. But every organization has ways of assuring some protection of the intellectual property of its members and letting them do what they wish for licensing it. I think the important thing is not to jeopardize the investment companies have already made because of new work that might be going in a related area. And software artifacts are a little bit different in terms of patent than the hardware stuff. And I think as we move to more of a software effort in all of open networking, I think it'll be less of an issue with patents. So typically, if you have a huge investment in something and it's taken you years to do it, you want to protect that for a while. And that's why it's still so important in pharmaceuticals. It's a little bit increasingly less important in technology and more so in software than in hardware.
So Jim, how do people deal with open source and intellectual property?
The patent system is a mess. You know, it's a real issue. I think that there are a lot of bad patents out there. I think that and they hurt innovation, and they don't just hurt open source or open source projects. I mean, they hurt the entire tech industry, right? And I think it's a real problem, in particular in software. So it's a real mess. You know, layer on that non-practicing entities and all these things, it's horrible. So I think that what we need to do, and we do this at the Linux Foundation, we have a whole variety of programs based on this, is decide, share what you want to share, and keep what you want to keep, and reward real innovation, not a bunch of crappy patents, right? You know, and there are mechanisms to do that. The open source licenses themselves are a good method to be able to understand what IP you're sharing, what you want to keep. We have a patent commons that we've developed at the Linux Foundation where people can donate these things. There are organizations like the Open Invention Network, which is an interesting model. They actually acquire IP on the secondary market. They offer that IP, a license to that IP, to organizations for free in exchange for one thing, a covenant not to sue Linux based on a definition of Linux that they had developed jointly with a wide variety of stakeholders. So is it a problem? Yes. Are there ways to work in the system? Yes. Does the system need reform? Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Margaret.
Okay, so as you know, the carriers are trying to virtualize all the network functions and do SDN controllers and get involved in open source, right? We've been having lots of discussions. But if I look, there's a lot of proliferation of open source organizations. So you have Cloud Foundation, you have ODL, you have Open Data Plane, right? That's supposed to be this whole DBTK piece. How do corporations keep up with all this and join all these open organizations and still deliver?
Is that Margaret?
Yes, it's Margaret.
Well, I'd like to take a stab at this because I think the characteristics are similar to the standard setting industry, which is an industry. You have lots of ISO and IEEE and IT, all these. And so the classic joke, what's the great thing about standards, so many to choose from? I guess the same can be held for open source, right? There's lots of competing projects out there. What's interesting is in the last 5-6 years, our foundation has had a lot of organizations come to us and say, we need a credible place to host these that has a well-regarded IP regime, audited financials, a track record for building communities and so forth. And so as a result, we've kind of become a foundation of foundations. And that is probably likely to continue, where you see some consolidation in sort of the top 10 organizations that will be hosting open source projects. I mean, you know, if you look at us, Mozilla, Eclipse, the Apache Software Foundation, and maybe a few others, they're really the big behemoths that are probably very credible that you should look to as host for projects that are credible, and then the bar drops very sharply from there. That's not to say that, you know, there's some pretty good code up on GitHub. It's just sort of randomly up there, but likely once it reaches a point of maturity, it goes to one of these foundations. So that's one indicator that I think.
So you're saying as the consolidation will happen, a corporation like AT&T has to deal with just a couple of these foundations, and as a result, they can monitor or they can keep track of multiple open source projects. But still, if AT&T wants to build a solution based on half a dozen or a dozen open source building blocks, how do you expect that to work?
So if you're asking me, I think,
or whoever, I mean, I think whoever.
This is a great question that I think Jono works a ton on, which is the best members of the Linux Foundation have not just people who are in charge of open source. They have entire organizations of dozens and dozens of people who manage what they call their external research and development. These are professionals who do nothing but monitor open source projects, which one's got more contributions, which one has less, which one is maturing, which one is good, which one is bad. My suggestion to AT&T and to everyone who's new to this is you need to build that competency up in your organization. If you spend $10 billion in internal R&D, you know, why don't you hire a few people to manage the $100 billion in external R&D that's freely available to you?
Jono, you want to say something? Or?
I think Jim has represented that pretty well. I mean, I would agree as well. There is this huge community of this patchwork of projects out there. And it gets back to the question earlier on about the definition of what makes a successful open source project and why some succeed and why some don't succeed. I don't think that being part of a foundation is a requirement, but for certain pieces of software that are particularly focused on the enterprise and infrastructure, there are many benefits to being part of a foundation that can help that succeed, not just in terms of the engineering, but also in terms of adoption as well. Jim said earlier on, you know, described the core ingredients that make an open source community, an open source project successful. But the key thing as well is about that project challenging itself and being relevant. It's like any creative work. If it doesn't stay relevant, then it's going to become irrelevant. A foundation won't solve that. Having those open source ingredients won't solve that. Great leadership will solve that.
Okay.
You guys, whoa, wow. You guys have made a great case for the success of open source, but almost the opposite model is also successful, like Uber proprietary, and I would point to Apple and Steve Jobs saying, you know, he's a fan of a super integrated proprietary system for the control. So tell us how you reconcile those two radically different models, and do you think Apple will change or they'll continue to do that?
Go ahead.
Name another example.
Successful one.
Right, but I think currently Apple has the largest market capitalization of any technology company. Facebook's trying to catch up, but it's close.
That doesn't mean it works very broadly, and they have a huge market of independent app developers that we know. So this is something the market will decide. We've seen how popular iPhones and iPads are, and we've also seen how popular Linux phones are.
You want to say anything?
I mean, I love Apple because if it wasn't for iPads, I would have to care for my 5-year-old. And so they definitely do a good job. I think the other parents. Apple already does one thing well with open source, which I previously pointed to. Nobody makes anything all by themselves. It's OS 10 is based on BSD. They use WebKit. I mean, they use a ton of open. So they're not dumb. They're not, The question I think you're asking, which is, does the walled garden approach, sort of the winner takes all method, work over a more open approach? And I would argue that the open approach, the latter, is better and works very, very well. But I'm not going to begrudge anybody from trying the winner takes all approach. I just think you're on the wrong side of history, per my previous point. When you combine a better, faster way to build technology with all the other aspects that I've talked about, I think you're on the wrong side of history.
But Jim, I mean, wouldn't you say that in any particular category, that is happening, right? When it comes to social networking, here is the king, and they have the most of the social networking. When it comes to search, Google, whatever. When it comes to handset devices, so the winner. So they are just being smart about how they use open source and then build that 20% you're talking about and create solutions that are interesting.
That's a different phenomenon. I mean, that's a winner-take-all market where you have something in common with other people, and that becomes the lingua franca of social networking, for example. So I think that's a different subject from whether it's open source or not.
Okay.
The thing is as well, if I can make one really short point, if you're willing to invest significantly in building a proprietary platform, there is no reason why you can't be successful. From the days of yore of open source and free software and all the rest of it, some people like to present it as this kind of ethical battle between those who are open and those who are not open, and that's to a significant degree it's a pretty stupid discussion to get into. You can be successful with proprietary software. I don't think anyone is denying that. The difference with open source is, first of all, you can do a lot more with a lot less because it's a commons that everyone can invest into. But the other thing as well is it starts solving common problems. And I think what that creates is, if you look at Apple and you look at Microsoft, those companies are successful from a bygone era. And what we see today is the startup landscape that we see today is largely driven by open source. It's driven by collaboration, where people are reusing pieces, like Jim said earlier on. People don't build all of their own stuff anymore. You can do that if you want to put billions of dollars into it, but there's no reason why you have to.
Okay, last question, and then we'll let you stop. Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Oh, okay, definitely. Go ahead.
Guru, it's been a great opening session so far. Very, very exciting stuff, and thanks to everybody. I wanted to ask an old question, and it is equally applicable to Linux, open source, and SDN. So going back to the enterprise networking audience, if you're an enterprise network engineer in your average company, as SDN has continued to evolve over these years, what would you say today? What should the average engineer be doing for the average company? Should they be out studying Linux? Should they be, or I'll leave that open-ended.
Yes on the Linux part.
I would simply say learn to code. I think that's where the industry is headed. It's going to be software driven.
You said?
Learn to code.
Learn the code. Learn to code.
Learn to code. Learn software. That's where industry is headed. If you look at all the large-scale networks or infrastructures, they're all working on software, and it only just goes downhill from there. So that technology will end up in the enterprise world as well, and it will also at the same time give you the agility that you don't have today. So instead of solving problems with people, you'll be solving problems with software a lot faster.
So another dimension, Art. This panel is not just about open source. It's about open. And there are, if you understand what should be open and more or less standard, it says don't waste your time on that. Go into something else and innovate above or below some kind of open interface. Solve a real customer problem that other people are not solving.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the DevOps movement is real. I talk to big cloud service providers who say, I just being a sysadmin these days is not good enough. I need people who understand the fundamentals of computing, who really understand how everything works together, who can be a part of that DevOps movement. I think that is going to benefit your career. The other thing is not only learn the code, what we say at the Linux Foundation is code is the new resume. If you can participate in a few projects and actually get a patch in there, I can probably find you a job.
Sadef, I want to ask one more question. Can I go a little longer? Okay. So I guess because this is an event primarily about SDN and we're talking about this open stuff, I did have a question primarily for Dan, but all of you can answer as well. Is SDN and open networking synonymous? Can one succeed without the other?
Sure. I hate to get into semantics.
Sorry?
Semantics. There is no single definition of SDN, Guru. So which version do you want me to answer according to?
Okay. That's all you want to say?
So, I mean, I think... No, of course not, Guru. Of course not. I know we have dinner coming up. So software-defined networking, according to my understanding and belief, is that you use software to make the network that is agile and flexible and not application dependent do what the software should be making it to do.
Okay.
Open networking says we have open standard interfaces and abstractions at the right places to make it possible to write software to control a network that is not specific to the network hardware.
Okay.
I can sort of throw in an example that might illustrate that, right? You can build an SDN-based network, but you still have to do monitoring to understand actually what's going on. And at time that monitoring or those stats and data has to come at the silicon level. And can you have an interface to the silicon to actually get data right off the chipsets, summarize it, and then ship it off to whatever your monitoring system is? You still need to write those pieces of code. So open networking is important from that point of view as well, is where do you have the visibility on how this SDN is actually working? And you need to write a bunch of code.
So hypothetically, sure. You know, so with SDN we separate this whatever forwarding and control plane. In the control plane, can we have 10 years of Microsoft owning the Windows before Linux became dominant in at least in the server space and so on? Even on the desktop, today Microsoft is still dominant operating system. So can that happen to SDN and networking? That yes, we separate the control plane. Yes, there is an open interface between the control and data plane, but the control plane operating system is controlled by one vendor. And yes, there are APIs and you can write applications on the top. Could that happen? And what are we doing to make sure that doesn't happen?
So it's a fear of some people that could happen. And that whereas one company dominated the years of protocols, another company will dominate the years of APIs. And it could be that the battleground of the next 3 years is going to be the northbound interface. And somebody says, I'll define this, and then don't worry about what's underneath it. I'll supply everything, and it'll be closed and proprietary. What can we as a community do to avoid that? I think we can have a variety of community-created northbound interfaces for particular purposes that get implemented, deployed, tested, and improved.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it could happen. I do think there's one interesting dynamic going on in the enterprise equipment and software industry, which is, and I'll put Facebook on the spot here for a second, the fact that you have a Facebook and an Amazon and Google, companies who make their money off of search or my wonderful Facebook image crafting, that are keeping the rest of the industry honest because they actually have the engineering resources and knowledge to go start an open compute project, to go build this stuff on their own. I think that's a very different dynamic than before, where people were very, very dependent on a smaller set of organizations who really had all of the exclusive skills and knowledge to do something. I don't think that exists anymore. So could it happen? Yeah. Is it likely to happen? Probably not.
I think that is a very positive comment, and on that, maybe we should end this panel. So thank you so much. And I think they did a great job. Before you go, we do have a reception. And the exhibit hall is open, so please check out the reception and the exhibit hall as well. And again, thanks to all our panelists.